He Beach at Omaha was never supposed to exist for men like Private James Fletcher. It wasn't supposed to be a place where he would find himself on a Tuesday morning in June, carrying equipment that marked him as a target, marked him as someone important and simultaneously someone disposable. He'd made a mistake, a catastrophic, unforgivable error that violated every single protocol in the tactical handbook, every unwritten rule of military hierarchy, and every principle that Major Harold Caldwell had spent 20 years enforcing with an iron fist that had crushed the spirits of hundreds of soldiers beneath it. His commanding officer had done more than simply reprimand him. He'd stripped him of his rank in front of the entire unit on a cold morning in May, removed his insignia with deliberate theatrical slowness, allowing every soldier to see what happened when you questioned authority. He'd removed him from his bunk and assigned him to the barracks with the newest recruits, the ones who were still afraid, who still had that wide-eyed look of people who hadn't experienced combat yet. He'd threatened court-martial proceedings that would likely result in imprisonment or execution by firing squad, had made it clear that Fletcher's future contained nothing but darkness and punishment. And then, in what was perhaps the cruelest decision of all, he'd assigned him to the most dangerous, most exposed, most likely to result in immediate death position in the entire Normandy operation. He was to carry the satchel. Not ammunition, because ammunition could be replaced easily enough, and there would always be more ammunition, more crates arriving from factories in America. Not medical supplies, because men could die without them, and that was simply the accepted cost of war in 1944, something that every soldier understood and had come to terms with. Something far more critical, far more valuable, and far more dangerous than either of those things. The portable radio unit that would connect their isolated platoon to headquarters across the English Channel. It weighed 32 pounds when fully loaded with batteries and transmission equipment, and the necessary cables and frequency oscillators and transformers that made it function. It had a functional range of maybe 5 miles on an exceptionally good day, with favorable weather conditions, and no atmospheric interference or enemy jamming. In reality, it was usually less, and in the absolute chaos and confusion and overwhelming sensory assault of combat, when metal was flying through the air in every direction, and explosions were reshaping the landscape by the second, and everything was nothing but noise and smoke and violence and the smell of death, it would make him a target. It would make him visible to every German sniper on those bluffs. It would make him the most important man in the platoon, and simultaneously the most expendable, most likely to be cut down, most certain to die before the sun set that day. Soldiers at war develop an almost supernatural intuition about death. It's not something that can be taught in the classroom or explained in military manuals by officers who have never heard the sound of real combat. It's something that grows out of prolonged exposure to danger, out of the collective weight of thousands of small moments where survival was uncertain and luck was the determining factor between life and oblivion. It's something that comes from seeing men die, from hearing the sounds they make, from processing the reality that death is not theoretical anymore, but immediate and present. They learn to smell it coming like rain before a massive storm rolls across the horizon and transforms the entire landscape, like the smell of ozone in the air before lightning strikes. They can feel it in the temperature of the air around them, sense it in the way the wind shifts direction and pressure, recognize it in the tension of their own muscles and the sudden dryness in their mouths that no amount of water can relieve, and the acceleration of their heartbeats that becomes almost painful. Private Fletcher had been experiencing that sensation, that overwhelming, inescapable certainty of impending death, for the past 72 hours. It had started as a whisper, barely perceptible, when they were briefed on the operation in that concrete bunker near the English coast, just a small voice in the back of his mind suggesting that this was going to go wrong. It had grown to a constant presence when they boarded the transport ships and watched the English coast disappear behind them, watched England fade into the mist and fog, understanding that there was no turning back now. It had become an inescapable weight when they were given their final equipment checks and told that this was it, that this was real, that within 24 hours they would either be alive or dead, and there was no third option. And now as he descended the landing craft ramp at exactly 6:47 a.m. on June 6, 1944, stepping into the cold water of the English Channel, feeling it soak through his boots and his socks and begin to numb his feet, it had become a roaring certainty, a voice in his head screaming that he was walking into his own death, that this was the moment when his life would end. He could feel death walking toward him through the surf, like an old friend finally coming to collect what he was owed, like a debt that had come due. Around him, men screamed in agony, their voices cutting through the constant percussion of machine gun fire, their bodies torn apart by the disciplined mechanical violence of the German defensive positions that had been waiting patiently for them on those bluffs. He watched his best friend, a kid named Tommy from Boston who still had letters from his girlfriend in his shirt pocket, still talked about marrying her when the war ended, fall into the sand with blood blooming across his chest in a flower pattern of red. He watched a medic who'd been trying to reach a wounded man get shot before his knees even hit the ground, his body going rigid and then going limp, becoming just another body on a beach full of bodies. He watched officers trying to establish a chain of command disappear into the chaos, watched their leadership evaporate as quickly as morning dew in summer heat. He watched men who'd been alive and moving and thinking seconds before become nothing more than obstacles on the beach, things that other men had to step over or around as they continued moving forward. And through it all, despite the overwhelming urge to freeze, to surrender to fear, to simply lie down in the sand and accept what was coming, to give up and let it end, Fletcher kept moving forward, kept carrying that radio, kept protecting it like it was the most precious thing in the world, because in that moment, in that place surrounded by death on every side, it was. 6 hours earlier, in a concrete bunker near the English coast, surrounded by maps and tactical diagrams and strategic plans that had been debated and revised and finalized by generals who would never set foot on the sand of Normandy, surrounded by officers in pristine uniforms that would remain clean and unwrinkled throughout the entire invasion, surrounded by the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke and the staleness of air that hadn't been fresh in months, Private James Fletcher had made his stupid mistake, the kind of mistake that gets junior enlisted men court-martialed, the kind of mistake that gets you labeled as insubordinate, unreliable, a threat to order and discipline, a cancer within the structure of military hierarchy, a disease that needed to be cut out before it spread, the kind of mistake that in some cases gets you executed by firing squad as an example to others, as a warning to anyone who might think about questioning authority. During the briefing, and this detail is critical to understand everything that follows, to understand how a single moment of speaking up would reshape the entire course of events, officers and senior non-commissioned officers had been distributed highly classified information regarding a German ammunition depot that was supporting the defensive positions at Normandy. The intelligence had been gathered through multiple sources: reconnaissance photographs, prisoner interrogations, captured German documents that had been hastily translated by men who were trying to work as quickly as possible. The briefing packet contained everything: precise coordinates down to the nearest 10 meters, defensive positions and guard rotations that had been established by German high command, estimated ammunition stockpiles broken down by type and quantity and caliber, expected resupply schedules that had been reverse-engineered from German logistical documents, vehicle access routes, and the times when supply trucks typically arrived. Everything that an intelligence officer could possibly want to know about the target. The information was classified as eyes only for officers rank of lieutenant and above, classified as so sensitive that it couldn't even be discussed with enlisted men who might gossip or accidentally reveal information to German sympathizers. Lower ranks were not supposed to ask questions about such matters. They were not supposed to analyze the strategic significance. They were not supposed to think beyond their immediate orders and what they'd been specifically told to do. They were expected to move when ordered, shoot when ordered, follow orders without hesitation or deviation, and never question the decisions made by the officers above them. They were expected to follow the chain of command with absolute obedience, with the kind of obedience that made armies function, that made hierarchies work, that prevented chaos. But Fletcher, a quick-minded kid from Detroit who'd worked in accounting for 5 years before the war, who understood numbers and logistics and supply chains and the way that data could reveal patterns and inconsistencies and errors that human beings might miss, who had a natural talent for spotting discrepancies in information, who'd been trained to find mistakes because that was his job in the civilian world, had been standing near the map table when a junior officer named Captain Douglas was reviewing the coordinates allowed for another officer, reviewing them to make sure they were correct before they were finalized. And Fletcher had seen something. He'd seen it immediately. The coordinates listed for the ammunition depot didn't align correctly with the topographical features shown on the map. By Fletcher's mental calculation, a calculation he'd done in his head in about 4 seconds, running through the numbers like an accountant balancing a ledger. The coordinates were off by approximately 320 yards to the southwest. Maybe it was 310 yards, maybe it was 340 yards, but definitely wrong. The difference was too significant to be a simple transcription error. In an accounting firm, pointing this out would have been praised and rewarded. In a corporate office environment, catching errors was literally part of the job. It was what you were paid to do. You were supposed to find the mistakes, correct them, prevent them from propagating through the system. But this was the United States Army in 1944, and this was Major Harold Caldwell, a man of the old school who believed that order meant absolute silence and respect meant complete obedience without questions, without hesitation, without any deviation from the chain of command. Caldwell had been an officer since 1923. He'd survived the Great Depression. He'd risen through the ranks by doing exactly what he was told and by never, ever questioning the wisdom of his superiors. He believed that the military functioned because of hierarchy, because of structure, because of the absolute and unquestioned acceptance of command authority. Fletcher, who'd seen the error, who understood its potential significance, who knew with near certainty that in combat those 300 yards could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure, had raised his hand. He had spoken up. He had said, "Sir, I think there might be an error with those coordinates." In the rigidly hierarchical, almost medieval structure of military command in 1944, this action was grounds for severe disciplinary action. This was insubordination. This was a challenge to authority. This was a junior enlisted man, a private, the lowest rank possible, questioning an officer's information. His commanding officer, Major Harold Caldwell, had frozen in place. His face had gone red, the color spreading up from his neck like a flood. The veins in his temples had become visible, pulsing with anger. The entire room had gone silent. Everyone stopped what they were doing. Everyone stared. And then Caldwell had ordered Fletcher arrested on the spot. He'd had 2 military police officers physically remove Fletcher from the room and place him in a holding cell. The charge sheet they'd started filling out had 3 items: insubordination, conduct unbecoming of a soldier, and challenging the authority of a superior officer. Fletcher had spent the next 5 hours in a holding cell, a small concrete room with a single bench and nothing else. He'd imagined a court-martial. He'd imagined being sentenced to years in a military prison. He'd imagined being sentenced to death by firing squad, which was actually possible for insubordination in a combat zone. He'd imagined never seeing Detroit again, never seeing his mother again, never seeing Sarah Martinez, the girl he'd planned to marry after the war. He'd imagined his entire future evaporating in the course of a single moment, a single decision to speak up, to point out something he'd seen. But as punishment, as demonstration, as some form of public humiliation designed to make an example of this uppity private who thought he was smarter than the entire chain of command, Major Caldwell had made a decision that was, in its own way, more cruel than a death sentence. Fletcher would not be court-martialed yet. That would happen after the invasion, if he survived. That was the key phrase. If he survived. For instead, as punishment, as a way of showing what happened to soldiers who challenged authority, Fletcher was assigned to the most dangerous job in the entire Normandy operation. He would carry the radio into the beach assault. He would be a priority target for German snipers. He would almost certainly die. And in dying, he would serve as a reminder to every soldier in the platoon about the cost of questioning authority, about the importance of accepting the chain of command without question or hesitation. What Major Caldwell didn't understand, what no one could have predicted, what was impossible to see in that moment, was that Fletcher's stupid mistake, his decision to speak up, his observation about the coordinates, would by sunrise the following day save the lives of 38 soldiers in his immediate unit and would fundamentally, permanently alter the tactical situation in their entire sector of Omaha Beach. And this is the true story of how it happened. June 5, 1944, arrived with grey skies that seemed to press down on the entire English coast like a physical weight. The skies were so dark that it looked like dusk, though it was only late afternoon. The sea was churning, violent, foam-capped waves that made even experienced sailors queasy and uncomfortable. The transport ships carrying the invasion force had been crowded with men for 3 days now, packed into holds and on deck, trying to find any position where they could rest, trying to mentally prepare for something that couldn't really be prepared for, trying to come to terms with the fact that this was real, this was happening, this was not a drill or a training exercise. Private James Fletcher stood on the crowded deck of the USS Samuel Chase, one of the transport ships in the massive armada, feeling the spray against his face, tasting the salt in his mouth, feeling the wind cut through his uniform, knowing with near certainty that it would be the last time he felt anything other than pain. The other men around him were locked in their own private silences, each soldier wrapped in the unique isolation of anticipating his own death, separated from everyone else by the knowledge that within hours he would either be alive or dead. Some were praying. Fletcher could see their lips moving even though no sound came out, could see them counting on their rosaries or crossing themselves or whispering words that only they could hear. Some were writing letters they'd never send home, trying to find words adequate to the moment, trying to capture something meaningful in words that would probably never be read by anyone. Some, like Fletcher, simply stared at the horizon and thought about everything they were leaving behind. He thought about his mother, who still lived in that small house on Woodward Avenue in Detroit, the one with the porch where they used to sit on summer evenings and drink lemonade and listen to the sounds of the neighborhood. He thought about Sarah Martinez, the girl he'd planned to marry after the war, the one he'd been dating for 2 years before he was drafted. He thought about her dark eyes and her laugh and the way she'd kissed him the night before he left for basic training. Her last letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, and Fletcher had read it so many times that the paper had started to tear along the creases. He kept it in his jacket pocket now, and he'd read it again this morning before they boarded the landing craft. He thought about the fact that he'd probably never see either of them again. He thought about the fact that his mother would receive a telegram from the War Department. He thought about the fact that Sarah would eventually move on, would eventually date someone else, would eventually forget about the boy from Detroit who'd gone to war and never come home. The radio equipment hung from his shoulders like a crucifix, like the weight of every sin he'd ever committed, like destiny itself was trying to physically press him into the ground to keep him from moving forward. In his pocket, along with Sarah's letter, along with a photograph of his mother, he carried the frequency codes that would mean the difference between coordinated fire support and complete, utter chaos on the beach below. Those codes were memorized by only 3 men in the entire operation. If Fletcher died, the backup operator would take over. If both died, the 3rd man would transmit. But there would be delays in the transfer. There would be confusion about which frequencies to use. In a battle where seconds mattered, where timing meant everything, where a delay of even a few minutes could result in dozens of men being killed by friendly fire or by German counterattack, those delays could cost lives. The radio operator back at headquarters, a veteran sergeant named Mitchell who'd fought in North Africa and Sicily and had survived when thousands of others hadn't, had given him one piece of advice during the equipment handover. The 2 of them had been alone in the communications tent, and Mitchell had held Fletcher's shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. "Keep it dry, keep it hidden, and pray it works when you need it most," Mitchell had said. Fletcher had responded with a bitter laugh that surprised even himself. "Pray," he'd repeated. "Sure, I'll do that. I'll pray real hard." The landing craft began rocking violently as the invasion fleet approached the coast of France. The motion was making men sick. The smell below deck was overwhelming, a combination of diesel fuel and vomit and fear and sweat and human waste. Fletcher could already hear the distant sound of artillery fire, could see the puffs of smoke on the horizon, could hear the distinctive, almost musical crackle of German MG-42 machine guns, a sound entirely different from the American equivalent, higher pitched, faster, more aggressive, more terrifying to the men who'd studied it in training but had never heard it for real. Around him, men were visibly falling apart under the weight of anticipation. One soldier in the corner of the landing craft was vomiting repeatedly into a bucket, his entire body shaking with each heave. Another was staring at his rifle like he'd never seen it before, like it had suddenly become alien and incomprehensible, turning it over and over in his hands as though studying it would somehow explain what was about to happen. One man clutched his rifle so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The skin stretched so thin you could see the individual blood vessels beneath the surface. The veins looked like they might burst from the pressure. Thomas, the farm boy from Iowa, the one who'd become Fletcher's friend over the past weeks of training, who'd told Fletcher stories about his family farm and his girlfriend back home, squeezed his shoulder and said, "See you on the other side, brother." Fletcher wanted to respond, wanted to say something meaningful, something memorable, something that would matter if one or both of them died in the next hour. He wanted to say something that would make this moment significant, that would elevate it from mere tragedy to something with meaning. But no words came. His mouth was too dry. His throat was too tight. He wasn't sure there was another side. He wasn't sure there was anything beyond this moment except pain and possibly death. The ramp went down. The sound it made was deafening. Metal against metal, the hydraulics straining under the weight. The beach revealed itself in all its terrible, magnificent horror, a hellscape of twisted barbed wire that had been laid down in intricate patterns, massive concrete obstacles called check hedgehogs designed to stop landing craft and vehicles, burning vehicles still smoldering from earlier waves of the invasion, scattered bodies both alive and dead, some moving and screaming, some perfectly still and silent, some pieces of bodies in places that made no anatomical sense. The beach was narrower than anyone had anticipated. The slope was steeper. The German defensive positions on the bluffs above were more fortified than intelligence had suggested. The barbed wire was more extensive. The anti-tank obstacles were more numerous. And then the order came, just a simple gesture from an officer, just a pointing forward, and they ran. Private James Fletcher ran with 38 other soldiers from his platoon, their feet splashing through the shallow water, their equipment weighing them down, making each step feel like it was through mud, their breath coming in ragged gasps that fear and exertion and the physical strain combined into something almost unrecognizable as human breathing. Behind them, the landing craft continued to disgorge more men into what amounted to a meat grinder of Omaha Beach, what amounted to organized slaughter. Around them, the German defensive positions on the bluffs poured fire down with methodical precision, with the discipline of soldiers who had been training for this exact scenario for months, who had run through the calculations of how many bullets they would need and how to position their machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire. This wasn't combat. Combat implies two sides with some possibility of mutual destruction, some possibility that both sides can fight, and one side might win. This was organized destruction. This was slaughter dressed up in tactical language. This was what happened when one side had prepared extensively and the other side had miscalculated almost everything about how the battle would unfold. Fletcher's platoon officer, a young lieutenant named Raymond Morrison from New York City, had briefed them on a plan yesterday. The plan was relatively straightforward, relatively simple, the kind of plan that makes sense when you're looking at it on a map in a safe room. The plan was, advance up the beach toward a natural draw, a pathway cut through the bluff by erosion over the course of centuries, a natural geographical feature that would provide cover and protection. If they could reach it, if they could make it across the exposed beach and into that draw, they could take cover behind the elevated terrain. From there, they could establish a defensive position and call for support, call for air cover, call for artillery from the ships offshore. The plan was sound on paper. The execution was proving to be almost impossible in the face of the machine gun fire and the artillery and the general chaos of the invasion. Within the first minutes of the assault, before they'd even covered 100 yards of beach, before Fletcher had even begun to process that he was really here, that this was really happening, Lieutenant Morrison took a German bullet directly through the throat. He went down without a sound, just a shocked expression crossing his face, his hands reaching up to his neck as blood poured out between his fingers, running down his uniform, turning the grey fabric dark red. He was dead before his knees hit the sand. The next senior man was Sergeant William Cross, a brutal career soldier who'd fought in North Africa and Sicily and knew what to do when officers died and plans fell apart and everything went wrong. Cross was 62 years old, or at least he looked that old, his face weathered by the sun and by decades of military service, and he'd seen enough combat to understand that the only way forward was through. He understood that you couldn't stop, couldn't freeze, couldn't hesitate. The only way to survive was to keep moving, to press forward, to minimize the time spent exposed to fire. He began rallying the men, pointing them toward the draw, providing what cover fire he could with his M1 rifle, moving from position to position, from piece of burning debris to piece of concrete obstacle, dragging wounded men when he could, leaving them when he couldn't, making the kinds of decisions that haunt a person for the rest of their life. Fletcher moved with them, the radio pressed against his chest, protected by his body armor, protected by his careful positioning and his constant awareness of where the fire was coming from. His heart was pounding so hard, he could feel it in his ears, could feel it in his throat, could feel it in his fingertips. The salt spray mixed with gunpowder smoke until everything tasted like copper and seawater and decay. The sand beneath his feet was slick with blood and seawater and the fluids of dying men, and somehow, impossibly, after what felt like both seconds and hours, after an eternity compressed into a few minutes, 38 men, including Fletcher, made it to the draw alive. They collapsed behind the natural barrier of the elevated terrain, gasping for breath, bleeding from various wounds both large and small, but alive. The noise of battle continued around them. Behind them, the beach continued to accept fresh casualties as new waves of landing craft continued to arrive throughout the morning. Sergeant Cross gathered the survivors behind the barrier of the draw. The men were in various states of shock and injury. 38 men remained from their platoon of over 100. Most of the others were dead or dying, or so severely wounded that they couldn't continue fighting. They had ammunition, not enough, nowhere near enough, but enough for the immediate moment, enough to hold the position for a little while. They had some medical supplies, though the medics who would have used them were mostly dead or missing. And they had Fletcher's radio, still functioning, still protected, still carrying the potential for connection with the command post across the channel. Cross looked at Fletcher with an expression that was difficult to read. Cross had been told that Fletcher had done something seriously wrong, something that had gotten him stripped of rank and assigned to this suicide mission, assigned to carry the radio, knowing that he would almost certainly die. But war has a remarkable way of erasing past grievances and personal animosities when everyone is focused on the single shared objective of staying alive for just 5 more minutes, just 5 more minutes after that, just 5 more minutes after that. Radio working? Cross asked, his voice surprisingly calm given that bullets were still occasionally snapping past overhead, given that they could hear German voices shouting orders from the positions above them. Fletcher tested the equipment, turning the dials with careful precision, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline, whispering into the receiver so as not to advertise their position to the Germans. Static, nothing but static, more static. And then, miraculously, cutting through all that static like a voice calling from another dimension, a response. He could hear the distant voice of the command post, crackling and distorted but unmistakably there, asking for their position and status. The radio was operational. The connection was established. The voice on the other end identified itself as Captain Herbert Munro, the commanding officer at the Beach Operations Center. What Private Fletcher didn't know, what no one in the entire operation could have known in that moment, what would only become clear over the next 30 minutes, was that his intervention in the briefing, his questioning of those coordinates, his stupid mistake that had cost him his rank and nearly cost him his life, was about to become the most critical piece of intelligence in the next 30 minutes of combat. Everything that had happened up to this point, all the training, all the planning, all the intelligence gathering, was about to be eclipsed by a decision that would be made in the next few minutes, a decision that would be based entirely on the information that Private James Fletcher had noticed, and the courage that he'd shown in speaking up despite the consequences. Behind them, behind the bluff, the German position controlling the defensive sector had been carefully calibrated and meticulously prepared over months of fortification work. The Germans knew that an invasion was coming. They didn't know exactly when or exactly where, but they knew it was coming, and they'd spent months, years in some cases, building what they believed would be an impregnable fortress, a position that could withstand any assault. They had mortars, they had machine guns positioned at overlapping fields of fire, they had anti-tank obstacles, and they had ammunition, lots and lots of ammunition, more ammunition than they could possibly use in a single day of combat. The German officer commanding the position was Oberleutnant Franz Weber, a career soldier in his early 50s who'd fought in both world wars and had seen enough combat to understand exactly what was coming, who'd felt that same intuition about death that soldiers develop over time. He'd received regular supply shipments to that exact location for 3 weeks. The ammunition had been stockpiled in a reinforced bunker, 500 yards to the southwest of the main defensive position, a location that had been designed to be protected from artillery, but still close enough for rapid resupply when the fighting started. Weber had enough ammunition to hold the position for days, more than days, maybe a week if they rationed carefully, maybe longer. The ammunition supply seemed almost unlimited from his perspective. What Oberleutnant Weber didn't know was that the coordinates for his ammunition depot, the same coordinates that Private James Fletcher had questioned in that briefing bunker in England, the same coordinates that had gotten Fletcher court-martialed and assigned to carry the radio, were the exact location where his main ammunition supply had actually been stored just 48 hours earlier. But due to a simple supply mix-up, a communication error between different German commands, and the decision of a bored German quartermaster sergeant who decided that he could reorganize the entire ammunition storage system on his own authority. The entire ammunition stockpile had been moved at the last minute. The ammunition depot was now 500 yards away from where it was supposed to be, 500 yards away from where the Americans believed it to be based on their intelligence. Fletcher had noticed this discrepancy. He had been punished for noticing it, and within the hour he was about to be vindicated in the most spectacular, most consequential, most life-changing way imaginable.